like we just noticed that these less than symbols, if it's a less than, this is your cheat sheet. It means that it's going to be and. So less than means and. Which means that your graphs are going to look something kind of like this. Technically speaking, they could be a no solution, but I don't give you any of those today, I don't think. Actually, there is one today. You'll see. The greater than symbols mean yeah, or. So usually they look something kind of like this. Technically it could just be one arrow, or it could be all real numbers. That's your cheat sheet. Someone in second hour came up with a trick. If you come up with a trick, I'd love to hear it. But someone said, if you turn this into, you could turn these into like an R for or. I thought that was nice. You come up with something, just to remember it. Or you could just use your cheat sheet every time. Yeah?
If you just put a line on this, like it's two, like they're going this way. If you just put a line on one, and then on the other one, you can like R, then it actually spells
Or. Oh yeah, Like yeah, I know what you're saying. So if you had it like two of them, it would look like O, R. That's good. I like it. All you creative people. Okay. So I'm going to model how we solve these. Couple steps. It's really easy though. First thing you got to think about is this sign. Is this a less than or a greater than? Less than. So am I going to do and or? And. So I'm going to physically write the word and so I don't forget. I need to see that in your answer. So this part right here told us that it was and. Then, like with all absolute value problems, we split them up into two. We have the normal side, which would be x minus 3 is less than 8. Nothing changed. And we'll still have x minus 3. But instead of being less than 8, we're going to change the sign so it's greater than. And instead of 8, it's going to be negative 8. So two changes. Once you do that, it's smooth sailing from here. How do you get x by itself? Add 3.
Yeah.
So I'd have x is less than 8 plus 3. It's 11. And add 3 on the other side, so we have x is greater than negative 5. Why do I what? Okay. There's the answer. We got to graph it. Here's negative 5. Here's 11. We want the numbers that are less than 11 and bigger than negative 5. Does that make sense? Solving graph. Let's try another one. This symbol, is this going to be and or? And. This is an and. What's my next step?
Split them up.
Split them? So I'll have the normal side, n minus 8 is less than or equal to 2. And nothing changes with the n minus 8, but instead I always say flip and switch. So I flip the sign and switch it to negative. Let me solve. Add 8 on both sides. So n is less than or equal to 10. And n is greater than or equal to 6. So I have 6, 10, open or closed circles? Closed. I want all the numbers less than 10 and bigger than 6. All the numbers really in between them. You guys okay so far? Okay. Now we always have to pay attention to negatives. This is saying, negatives only matter for absolute value. This is saying that the absolute value of anything, absolute value, is less than negative 3. So let's think for just a second. Absolute value of anything is always going to give me a positive or negative number. Positive. So this is always going to be positive. This sign right here says less than. And this number right here is negative. Is this a true statement? No. Positive numbers can never, ever be less than a negative number. So this would be not a true statement. Which means no solution. So ands are the ones that can have no solution. There is one like that on the homework. All right, let's try some more. This symbol right here tells me and or. Or. Yeah, this is an or. Nothing gets by you guys. Then we split them. So I have the normal side. It's just 2x minus 3 is greater than 8. Or the messed up side, 2x minus 3, flip and switch. So I'm going to flip and switch. Switch them just for the inverses. And for, yesterday. Add 3. Two x is greater than 11. How do you get x by itself? Divide by 2. So x is greater than 11 halves. Or you guys can head out. Two x is less than negative 5. Divide by 2. X is less than negative 5 halves. This is an instance where decimals help us understand what's going on. I mean, technically, I'd like to see some fractions, But technically, if you converted it to a decimal so you know how to graph it, I'm okay with that. This as a decimal is 5.5. This as a decimal is negative 2.5. So if I graphed this, I'd be talking about, here's negative 2.5, here's 5.5. I want all the numbers bigger than 5.5 and all the numbers less than negative 2.5, just like that. All right, I think for part E, you guys understand what's going on, so I'm going to save us some time by skipping that one since we just had the fire drill. But I do want to talk about F. Absolute value of anything will always be positive. This time it says positive is greater than a negative. Is that a true statement? Always. It's always true. Positive numbers are always bigger than negative numbers, no matter what the negative number is. So this is a true statement. So what's my answer? All real numbers. Which as a graph would be all the numbers. Which again was up here on our or statement. Cheat sheet. Halfway there. Good work. This time we're going to go backwards. Yesterday we learned how to write this using a compound inequality. So there's a difference between compound and absolute value. Yesterday we did compound. How did we write it yesterday for this number line? Yep. X is greater than or equal to 2, and X is less than or equal to 4. That's yesterday. Compound inequalities. Two of them put together, like a compound word. Doghouse. Remember that? Coming back to you? Today, though, we're going to practice this with absolute value.
I'm taking in knowledge. I'm listening to the knowledge that has been provided.
The absolute value situation is going to look different. Your answer will always look like absolute value of X minus something. You got to find three things. Three things you're finding. Midpoint, inequality symbol, and the distance from the midpoint. Three colored boxes, three things we got to find. So over here on our steps, I'm going to tell you how to find those things. So I'll write here, answer always looks like this. Okay, in this box, step number 1, I'm going to start with pink. We need to find the sign, the inequality sign. So if you have an AND statement, is it going to be a less than or a greater than? It's going to be a less than. If you have an OR statement, it's going to be a greater than. So in our situation, what kind of symbol am I going to have here? Less than or equal to. Step 2, we need to find the midpoint. I'm going to make a note here that if it is positive, it'll look like x minus the number. But if it's negative, it would be x minus a negative, which turns it into x plus. These are just cheat sheet notes. I know I'm not showing you examples, so it's okay if you feel a little unsure right now. They'll become clear. So what's the midpoint of our example over here? 3. Is that a positive or a negative number? Positive, so I'm just going to plug in 3 right here. X minus 3, even though it's positive. The last thing we need is in the blue box. The blue box tells us the distance from the midpoint to the end point. How far is it from the midpoint to the end point? 1. So that's your answer. On your test, sometimes it's going to ask you for a compound. Sometimes it's going to ask you for absolute value. I make it super clear. It's like all caps. Just make sure. Sometimes students just forget. Okay, let's practice some more. On the next example, you got to fill in that circle. I made a mistake. They both should be closed. So here's this example. I know my answer is going to look like x minus. First step was what? Find the inequality sign. Is this picture an and picture or an or picture? And, so my symbol will be less than or equal to. Second step, find the midpoint. Yeah, the midpoint between -3 and 3 is 0. Last step, distance from midpoint to endpoint. So 1, 2, 3 hops. And you're done. That's the absolute value. Let's try this one. It's always, going to look like this to start with. That's absolute value of x minus. Where's my, what do I do first? this should be close to. What was that? Find a sign. What kind of picture is this? It's an or picture. What kind of sign am I going to have? Greater than or equal to, since my dots are closed. Midpoint. The two endpoints are 7 and 11. What's the midpoint in between those two? 9. It is a little funky because 9's not really part of the graph, but it is the midpoint. How far are the endpoints away from the midpoint? 2. Not too bad, right? Pretty straightforward. How about this one? This is going to be greater than or equal to because it's an or picture. Oops, sorry, not equal to though. Just greater than. Because the dots are open. But you're right, it's greater than. What's the midpoint? Good. And the distance from the midpoint? 1. From here to here is 1 hop. That's it for those. 2 more and then we're done. Sometimes you get some story problems. And they want us to write an absolute value inequality. This is going to be just like the normal line ones. These problems, when they're word problems like this, they're using the word differ or within. Differ or within. Differ or within is talking about and. It's hard to see that. It's like talking about between. So these problems will always be less than or equal to for word problems. So we need 2 things. So over here for the steps, I'll just kind of write that. X looks like this. We're looking for 2 things. We're looking for the midpoint and we're looking for the distance. What do you think the midpoint is for this first situation? Average rainfall in California for the last 100 years is 23 inches. The annual rainfall can differ by 10 inches from the average. What was that? 23 is the, yeah. 23 is the midpoint. It's the average. It's kind of that middle point that we're talking about. But it can differ by like 10 either way. So we have like the midpoint and you could be 10 more than that or you could be 10 less than that. So the distance is represented by 10. Does the number 100 have anything to do with anything? No. Last one, then we're done. X minus, got to find the midpoint and the distance. The survey showed that 65% of adolescents watched online video clips. It's probably higher than that now. Most of the responses were within 3 percentage points. So what's the 3 going to represent? The distance. That's usually pretty easy to find. So that means your other number would be 65, yep. And the midpoint. There's your homework. Lots of time.